Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics.
All right, we're here this week with journalist and author Paul Wells, and I figured for our 200th episode we'd have a little fun and talk about a light topic like what does this government need to do to pull itself out of the spiral they seem to find themselves in? I think the budget kind of landed with a bit of a thud, and they seem to be flailing on all of their messages, and I figured maybe Paul might have some insights. Paul.
So, first of all, it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
I'm so glad to have you.
Secondly, it's not that much of as death spirals go. It's not much of a death spiral.
Right.
I don't write about polls much these days, but I do follow them. And on Jean-Marc Fournier's is that no, well, it's bad.
338.
Yeah, on Philippe J. Fournier. Sorry, I had a brain freeze there. On
Yeah.
Philippe J. Fournier's aggregator site, 338. The Liberals and the Conservatives have been deadlocked, give or take a few points, for months.
Yeah.
That has the Conservatives doing better than under Poilievre than they did under Aaron O'Toole or under Andrew Scheer. But election campaigns matter enough that it's still possible to imagine the Liberals pulling it out.
Right.
It's possible to imagine the Liberals imploding. You can imagine anything, but the Liberals seem to have lost the thing that makes Liberals hard to beat in general, which is economic credibility.
Right.
And in the 2019 campaign, which was their first re-election effort, the one where they were reduced to a minority, I talked to a senior campaign official for the Liberals, and they said, we sort of have to polarize, because when we say economic credibility, when we say don't change horse in midstream, when we say in tough times you want an experienced captain, none of that works. So
Yeah.
what we have to do is say you don't dare vote for the other guys. And that's 4 years ago now, and I would submit that they should have had more credibility then than now, because the things that upset people who care about economic credibility, like constant deficits and a part-time finance minister, and wildly contradictory statements about the economy, and on and on and on. We've had more of that now than we had in 2019, and they really don't seem that interested in trying to bolster their economic credibility. So what do? Well, they had a pretty good week. Was it 10 days ago now? The Joe Biden week was a good week.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister's appearance at the Convoy Commission was a good week. And what did they have in common? They had in common sort of more communication rather than less, more explanation rather than less. It's the stonewalling that gets them in trouble.
Yeah.
It's the seeming to view disagreement and contradiction as illegitimate that gets them in trouble. And it's the understanding that it's a tough old world out there, and not everyone is going to like what they do, so they have to go out there and explain what they're doing, that gets them on a better track.
Yeah, and that's
that answer had a lot of pauses in it, because I was actually making it up as I went along. I was trying to puzzle through, why are they in trouble and how could they not be in trouble? And that's the best answer I have for now.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing that always gets me, is there are so many simple explanations for things that get them into trouble or that they could explain themselves out of, and they absolutely refuse to do it. And it boggles my mind. I mean, my most common phrase about this government is that they can't communicate their way out of a wet paper bag.
Yeah.
And it makes me, like how is this so difficult?
So governments, large organizations always have the characteristic of the person in charge. It's a thing that it's a simplistic reductionist thing it's a conclusion that I resisted for a long time, but you're stuck with it.
Yeah.
Brian Mulroney's government a million years ago was chatty and gossipy and like Brian Mulroney. And Stephen Harper's government was suspicious and vindictive, but often serious about serious things. And Justin Trudeau isn't great at communicating, because for most of his life, his problem was the opposite. There was all kinds of people who were interested in his message, and if to the extent that he had one, or if he wanted to have one, and what he needed to do was keep them out. And my earliest interactions with Justin Trudeau before he was in politics was very much a guy who was famous for being famous.
Yeah.
And would have people sort of pressing at him simply because of his last name. And so he developed defensive instincts quite early. And I think that in a social media age, when any of us who have any kind of public profile is deluged with criticism and, quasi harassment and genuine harassment in the case of many of our women colleagues, especially.
Yes.
Those defensive instincts are encouraged and honed rather than, So when it comes time to say, look, I know you're not going to agree on everything, but here's what I think and why I think it. I know that a lot of the discourse inside the government it's pointless to try. Nobody will believe it. They're not great at turning lemons into lemonades because they just think that they're just going to stay lemons. And I think that has a lot to do with the way the prime minister grew up. Yeah.
That's really interesting way of thinking of it, because I've never really thought about that kind of defensiveness before.
Yeah, I mean, he's like, I never knew the guy well. I had fewer conversations with Justin Trudeau before he became prime minister than I had with Stephen Harper before he became prime minister. And even in Harper's case, it wasn't a lot. But I remember bumping into him in Ottawa, and there was a topic he was trying to talk to me about, and he was being importuned by fun people who thought that fun Justin Trudeau was a fun person, and he kept having to sort of stiff arm other people so that he could pursue the conversation he wanted to have. And this whole interaction lasted about 5 minutes, but it really stuck with me, and I thought, imagine having to live your life that way all the time.
Yeah.
And anyway, we're getting further. I think we're getting a fair bit further into politics as biography than either of us expected. But this is just sort of what's on my mind today. On policy, look, I think the average Canadian doesn't care much about deficits.
Which
is why I've stopped writing about
that point.
Yeah, I think,
and part of it, I think, is also the media narrative tends to, as my line goes, it's 1995 and will always be 1995 for a particular cohort, both in finance, but also in certain foreign policy areas and so on. I mean, there is this bubble within this political environment where that is a truism, and I think that's partially where that comes from.
But on the other hand, what people do notice is whether somebody's claims about themselves hold up.
Right.
And this government keeps announcing that something new is a pressing priority, and that their first attempt to fix this problem that's out there in the world will work. And then it ends up not working. So, I mean, they were going to fix peacekeeping after like more than a generation of decline in Canadian peacekeeping.
Yeah.
They were going to bring peacekeeping back, and then it's as simple as this. Someone pointed out, peacekeepers often get shot at, and that was the end of it.
Yeah.
Like, they said they would legalize cannabis because they needed to reduce the prevalence of organized crime in the cannabis, retail sector.
Yeah.
And they needed to reduce the number of children who were smoking pot. And the government's own statistics. I mean, I looked recently. I've been meaning to write about it, but it matches, I think, what most people's hunch is, which is that the black market for cannabis sales is still essentially unchanged, because it's simply easier to buy your pot on the street than it is to buy it at a store. And you're likelier to get, I mean, I don't use the stuff, but you're likelier to get something that hits you, where you need to get hit. And the kids are still, it's not rampant, but it wasn't rampant before, and the number hasn't gone down.
Yeah.
So the whole rationale for the current situation, which is where there's a pot store on, every
other street.
Well, exactly,
particularly in downtown Ottawa.
Yeah, I mean, this is not at the center of any public conversation. I don't believe that a Prime Minister, Pierre Poilievre, would unlegalize pot, but it fits into a pattern where the government's claims about itself aren't persuasive.
Mm-hmm.
And then the stuff that I've been obsessing about in the knowledge economy, the Canada Digital Adoption Program, which is supposed to send armies of digitally savvy young people out to
businesses across the country.
Yeah, every mom and pop upholstery shop was going to become an e-commerce, and that really hasn't happened, and on and on and on.
Yeah.
And so my strong advice to this government for some years has been, you should just drastically simplify your offer. You should be claiming to fix fewer things, and you should be actually fixing more things. And I'm not particularly surprised that this government doesn't take my advice, but that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Are we at a point where the party needs fresh blood, fresh leadership, or is there an awareness of that at this point, or are they going to stick it out for one more cycle and hope that they can scrap it just one more time?
The Liberals I speak to are not particularly fond of Justin Trudeau. They would not disagree with much. The Liberals who speak to me would not disagree with a lot of what I've just said. But they're also terrified of a post-Trudeau Liberal Party, because he brings advantages that the field doesn't have. A famous name that resonates with the population. An appearance of openness and genuineness. And a kind of a feeling like he's some emissary from the future, that he's progressive, and that he would like Canada to go to a place of greater social justice and so on. Mark Carney, I think, is 100% as progressive in his politics as Justin Trudeau is, but he doesn't feel like that.
Yeah.
Chrystia Freeland confuses more and more of my colleagues. The chatter among journalists is it's not clear why we're supposed to think that she has a lock on the Liberal leadership and on the Prime Minister's job.
Mm-hmm.
I could run down the field. Look, it's hard work. I'd make a lousy party leader, right?
Yeah.
But there's a sense the Liberal Party was in decline until Trudeau came along, and that he represents a departure from that trend, but that the trend is has some chance of persisting after he's no longer the leader. So,
Okay.
you know,
And I guess I guess kind of a final question is, where do we see the next 2 years? Do we think that they can pull out? Do you think that they can learn the gospel of being frank with people, or does it just get more and more defensive the more time goes on? For me, there was one shining moment at the end of last summer when they had that ministerial roundtable who were about fixing all the problems, and they were actually frank with the media for one single press conference.
oh, this was the why can't you get a passport?
Yeah, yeah,
Task force, yeah.
yeah, and I don't know if that was because Marcia Ian was leading it, and she still had some of her journalistic chops, telling these ministers we need to be frank, and they were for one single press conference. Or was that just a one-off? Does things get even worse going forward?
I mean, so we haven't talked about the Conservative Party. I don't think Pierre Poilievre has begun to sort of make the case that he represents a more diligent, thoughtful, thick-skinned potential prime minister than the people he purports to replace.
That's true.
And then in a landscape like that, there was one election where the NDP under Jack Layton was able to get more than 100 seats. And then the question is, does Jagmeet Singh's NDP look like it's living in that world? And, the short answer is I don't presuppose any particular outcome in a future election. I think all outcomes are possible. I don't at all rule out the possibility that the Trudeau Liberals could win a fourth term, which would be the first time since Wilfrid Laurier that had happened. And it's entirely possible for politics to sort of just generally dissatisfy fans of politics. Like that's, it doesn't necessarily mean that as one falls, another has to rise,
Right.
But I guess to sum up my thinking, I think the most underserved constituency in the country right now is the people who think that a country like Canada should simply be well governed. Instead of all the various factions in our politics trying to use voters as a stick to beat their political opponents with, I think Canada's got enough governance problems that I would like to see people who found those problems interesting.
Yeah.
Anyway.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do this.
Well, thank you for the invitation.
All right. And hopefully we'll do this again in the future.
See you again.
All right. Cheers.
And that's everything for this week. Thank you for 200 episodes. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. Don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.